Hey everybody, welcome back to class. This is Human Communication with Bram Duffee. Today we're going to talk about identity related to our reading for Unit 2. Your identity is everything from your personality to the groups that you belong to. This stuff plays a huge role in how you communicate with others. And so today we're going to break down the importance of identity in communication because understanding it can totally transform the way that we connect with one another. First, you should know that identity and communication are completely interconnected. The way that you see yourself influences how you talk and listen and interact in any situation. And at the same time, communication also shapes your identity. So, have you noticed how talking to different people brings out different sides of who you are? Like when you're at work, you might communicate more formally and have this more professional identity compared to when you're with your close friends, where you might, loosen up and be more casual and able to show your relaxed side. It's just different, right? And each interaction shapes and shifts the identities that are involved. Now, one area where identity is especially important is intercultural communication. Different cultures often emphasize different aspects of identity. So, for instance, in some cultures, group identity, like family, religion, or community, is really prominent. Meanwhile, in the US, we often focus on individual identity, like our own achievements and personal values. These differences can really influence how messages are sent and understood across cultural boundaries. And so, understanding the role of identity also helps us with those differences. And so, what is exactly identity? Well, at its core, identity talks about the different categories that we as individuals connect with and find ourselves with as part of a group. And there's like a couple of different ways to think about it. I like to think about it as a primary and a secondary identity that we all have. And the primary identity would be the identity that someone would get by just glancing at you without much time to take in information. So they would be able to tell things like your nationality or gender, or if you're like a really tall person or a really small person, or, so those kinds of things would probably be fairly stable. And the secondary identities would be things like the fact that you do particular activities that are fun for you, and you identify as a student, and these are the kinds of shows that you watch. So these kinds of identities, the primary and secondary identities, can shift based on the situation or the context. Like, for example, you might strongly identify as a musician if you happen to be at a concert, but that's not something that would be at the forefront of a work environment that doesn't have anything to do with music, maybe. So those differences can help us, see how people are connected and to what level they might identify. And one thing is a identifying mark that shows easily would be something like a uniform or a T-shirt, or something that spells out things. And that's why words on what we wear matter so much. It's like having a costume on that we don't always remember. So the other level that I want to get to with identity is that there is a level of identity that can exist both at the individual level and then also at the collective level. And individually, we tend to focus on what makes us unique and how we're different from others. Like, so if you're an artist, your focus would be on your personal style, right? But collectively, our focus shifts to the groups that we belong to. So maybe you identify as part of an art collective, and as a group, You see your work different from the other art movements. But these levels, the individual and the collective, they're constantly at play, also shaping who we are. So here's where it gets even cooler. This identity topic is something that can be fixed and or dynamic. And so some aspects of who we are, like our cultural heritage or our early life experiences, they feel pretty set and stable. But other parts, like our hobbies or interests, can change over time and in different contexts. So, like, for example, maybe you were shy in high school, but now you speak confidently and while you're in public around people, and that you could attribute to the experiences that shaped your growth, like after school job. That these things that you go through that give you experience help shape our identities, because those identities are always evolving, especially as we interact with others and adapt to new situations. And so, speaking of interactions, these identities don't just exist in a bubble. They're shaped by where you're at and what's going on. Not just now, but things even in the past. So, like, think about, there are historical movements out there, like the civil rights movement, that shaped how people identify in terms of race or equality. And it's also how social movements around gender have influenced how people express their identities today. So, culture plays a huge role in shaping these things with perceptions and values and our behaviors. And, like, for example, some cultures in some environments, being reserved, that might be something that indicates respect. While in other environments, being outgoing shows confidence. So knowing where and how identities are shaped helps us better understand ourselves and also those around us. There's this really fascinating concept that's sort of attached to all this called symbolic interactionism. And it's this idea that we only find meaning through social interaction. And I think that it's kind of fun because there is some maybe connections that you can have in your own life. So if you think about it, um, how do we know what's really polite or what's really rude? It's not something that we figure out on our own. I mean, I've had classes in this. I got textbooks on, or I have books on manners, but it's not something that we figure out just by ourselves, because it's something that we figure out by interacting with others. It's like we observe someone else's reaction, and because of that reaction, we adapt. So we figure out based on their nonverbal expressions, based on what energy that they put out there, and it's sort of like correcting. Oh, this is too much. I'm speaking too loud. Oh, I'm being too over the top. Oh, maybe they're asking me for more. So all of those things you figure out through the social interactions that you have over time throughout your life. The other way that I think it's cool to talk about is this theory about reflected appraisals. And this means that our sense of self comes from how we think other people see us. So, for example, maybe growing up, your teachers always told you how creative you were. Well, over time, you might have started seeing yourself as a creative person because of people telling you that. And it's like holding up a mirror, but instead of your actual reflection, what you see is shaped by others' opinions. And so when you hear about yourself in a particular light, then that does do some reinforcement, right? If you have a haircut that really stands out that people seem to like, then that's going to make you want to probably keep that haircut. And it just transforms into other parts of who we are and how we present ourselves. Now, as far as how people get influenced by others, it's true that some opinions matter more than others. So, for instance, feedback from people like your parents or your close friends might have a huge impact. And feedback from other people might also have impact, but not as strong. And then we think about the amazing amount of influence that we have on our children up until the age of 7 or 8 or 9, and then about 9, all the shift happens to the other people's or other adults, right? So they don't care about what you, the parent, has to say because the new value is seen in the parents of their friends and their teachers and their friends themselves as they get older into teenage years. And so all of these things will have an opportunity to reflect back. And so these opinions do knock us into understanding that we are who we are. And I think about the extremes in that, the people who get treated really well and the people that get really not so well. And sometimes that is, of course, based on how people look and how they're perceived. And it's this whole comparison aspect that hits us. You know, when we have a social comparison, it happens when we are evaluating ourselves by comparing ourselves to others around us. And maybe you're a part of a group like coworkers or teammates. And if you're in that group and you feel like that you're the one that always comes up with the great ideas, then you might see yourself as a strong problem solver. But at the same time, you could be in a position of constantly comparing yourself to someone else who always seems ahead of you. And that might make you feel less confident. So you see how that works? This comparison stuff can build you up or it can challenge you. And either way, it does occur. And so there is, of course, something related to this that you may be familiar with called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is where it gets interesting, because when we think about our sense of self, self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when you expect something to happen, and because of that expectation, it does happen. And so imagine that you're about to give a big presentation and you think to yourself, I'm going to do great, I'm going to rock this. That belief could help you prep better, appear more confident, and actually deliver an awesome talk. But on the flip side, if you tell somebody, if you tell yourself that you're going to fail, then your behavior might reflect that and hit yourself with this downward spiral of negative, negative, negative. Basically, our expectations shape our reality, and that can influence our identity as well. So other aspects that are related to this identity and personhood is hitting on topics like self-concept, self-esteem, and self-respect. So first, your self-concept is your stable understanding of your personal traits. For example, you might see yourself as a good listener because of past conversations where you helped a friend through a tough time. All right, well, then there's self-esteem. And that's where positively or negatively you view those traits. So if you're proud of your listening skills, your self-esteem is high in that area. And then also, at the same time, there's this self-respect category. And self-respect is all about valuing yourself enough to demand and to offer respect, full kinds of treatment to others. And so standing up for your boundaries while also showing respect to others. And so these are all connected parts that help with our identity formation. This identity stuff is not just that we have it and that we are something. It's that we also perform it and perform this identity through communication. And that's what we call the performance of identity. Self-presentation plays a big role in this. It's the way that we shape how others see us. So if you imagine like you're heading into a job interview, you probably work hard to project confidence and professionalism, even if you're nervous inside. And that self-presentation in action, which is creating an image that matches how you want to be seen. All right, so that is this self-presentation part. Now, as you're thinking about the self-presentation, there are roles that are expected of us. And role expectations are like scripts that others give us based on who they think that we are or what situation we're in. So, for instance, at work, one of your traits is that folks might expect that you would be the problem solver. But at home, you just take on different roles, like being the funny one, or it's just our identities are changeable and mutable, and we adapt and emphasize different parts of ourselves depending upon the situation. And identity development is an ongoing process, and it's shaped by our interactions with other people. So from reflected appraisals to social comparisons, I talked about self-fulfilling prophecies. All these things are formed through every conversation that plays a role in who we are. And so through this self-performance and showing off your performance of identity, this is what we use to actively share who we are with the world. So have you felt like you've been influenced by the people around you? You know, maybe there's a part of you that's super unique, or maybe someone from society nudged you or pressured you or helped you fit into a mold that you weren't expecting. And that's kind of what we're looking at, is this relationship between identity and society, and how do we see ourselves? Because that connection is everywhere. And group norms and group pressures do often influence how we present ourselves, whether it's conforming to how we think we should dress or act or speak, or society might have a way of telling us that there are rules here, and we have to follow those in these situations. Let's look at racial identity, for instance. Did you know the concept of race really just has more to do with social categorization than genetics? And scholars point out that the genetic variation between any racial group is as wide as the variation across different ones. So it's just that race is still a powerful social concept. And our identification with different racial groups can also be shaped by societal forces. It's like ideas about race, they just often vary in different countries, and communication plays a huge role in reinforcing or changing those ideas. And what about multicultural identity? Many people today identify with more than one race. And that's such a powerful example of how identity doesn't just fit a neat little box label anymore. There are other categories that help us think about identity, and one of them is age. And so how old you are doesn't just come with a physical number. It often ties to social expectations about behavior also, right? So if we think about describing someone as a millennial or a Gen Z, or even label life stages like young person or midlife, and these categories, they shape not only how others view us, but how we view ourselves. So someone in their 20s might feel pressured to be super ambitious because society sees this as the time for their career growth. But similarly, on the flip side, someone in their 60s might feel bound and boxed in by stereotypes that say, hey, retirement means slowing down, or, especially if they feel more energized than ever. So these are all considerations. And I wonder what happens if we can take 20 years off to rejuvenate ourselves physically. Does that mean that we take on that new persona? I think sometimes yes, and we can see plastic surgery as an example of that. Social class is another topic that hits identity, and this comes from things like income and profession and education level. It's fascinating because people who share a similar social class, they often have overlapping worldviews. For instance, two middle-class families might have similar priorities about saving for college or owning a small home, but societal class also impacts communication, like the slang that we use or even the places that we feel comfortable going. The other identity component that connects is disability. You know, it's less about a fixed state and more about how people live with an impairment, whether it be visible or invisible, because society's attitudes towards that disability are going to shape how people see themselves all as well. So if a workplace is not accessible or doesn't lack accommodations, then obviously that limits someone's opportunities. And so these external forces do directly tie into how disabilities are communicated and also experienced. Religious identity is another big one. This isn't just about personal beliefs. It's also about how those beliefs interact with social and political views. For instance, someone might strongly identify as Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, not only in their spiritual life, but also in how they engage with the broader societal conversations. And communication plays a role here too, whether it's how traditions are explained or how spirituality is talked about within a community. The relationship between individual identity and society is this constant back and forth. Society shapes who we are through these expectations, norms, and interactions, and we respond by expressing who we are in ways that challenge or reinforce those ideas. And these identities are value laden. So what this means is that our communication reflects the values that we place on different identities, whether it's our own or that of others. So if we think about how this can turn into a whole another page of depth, ethics really means that our ethical identities can relate to how we treat people. And gosh, in some cultures, certain genders, races, or social classes are just given more respect and opportunities than others. And so when you interact with someone whose identity is in a position where the society undervalues, your words and attitude can either permeate those unfair norms or help challenge them. So maybe it's something as simple as listening intensely during a conversation, but at the same time, it could just be using inclusive language. It just is the kind of thing that we know can make all the difference. And speaking of language, have you thought about how much your vocabulary matters? You know, the words that we choose can either uplift or put people down, based on their identities. So if you use a harmful stereotype or dismissive terms, these things can help someone feel like they're being disrespected or make them feel invisible as a person. And so a real world example might be to casually call someone weak or lazy. And terms like that can trigger stereotypes about entire groups. But being intentional with your language does a lot different to show respect and help create a more equitable space for communication. Now, this brings us to a big danger, which is reducing people to a single identity type category. We do this all the time without realizing. And it's like, for example, if you meet someone and the first thing that you notice is their job or their ethnicity or their age, it's just natural. But the problem is that if we just stop there, we miss a lot because people are incredibly complex. And so when we pigeonhole someone into one identity, we end up missing out on the bigger picture of who they are. And worse yet, we could fall into the bucket of like just using stereotypes. And that would limit how we see and interact with with the other person. All of the identity stuff that we think about and talk about is just something that's not fixed. People change, and so do their identities. And maybe someone grows into a new role, like becoming a parent for the first time, or they transition into a new cultural setting. Even something like personal preferences are something that can evolve. So being open to these shifts and not boxing people into the person that they used to be or that they showed themselves to be one time, that's just a sign of ethical communication. And ethics, in addition to identity, are deeply intertwined in this whole communication front. It's every interaction. Every interaction is an opportunity that you can use to show respect and value and show how you understand how someone is unique and different from you. So be mindful of your words and challenge stereotypes. And in general, we just have to remember that identities aren't set in stone. They do grow and change, just like we do. Thanks for hanging out with me with this lecture today, and I look forward to your discussion board prompts.